Now the announcements are over. Just gonna make sure it's working. Yes. All right. Well, welcome to Grace and Truth for Sabbath morning, April 17. And our topic this morning is 1 Corinthians 7. So when I looked ahead 2 or 3 weeks ago and saw that this was my topic, I said, oh boy, I thought of the old TV game show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? And I decided not to poll the audience, but instead I decided to phone a friend. So I reached out to Daniel Flores, who's been a member of our class for years, because I was thinking, I'm a doctor, I know a little bit about sex. Daniel's a trained minister, went through the seminary, and he's also a trained psychologist. So this morning we're going to co-teach this lesson. We're not going to talk much at all about divorce. I hope that you listened to the audio recording of Dr. Richard Neese. I thought that I'm grateful to Ted for pointing that recording out, and I found it using the Google. And if you haven't listened to that, I think many that have would recommend it highly. So this is what we're going to talk about today. Love, marriage, and sexuality. And I thought that in order to kick off the lesson, I would begin by doing a little bit of an overview. So I've got the passage here in front of me, and I'm going to just highlight in 5, 6, 7 minutes, highlight a few key thoughts to set the stage, and then we'll go on with our class and with some discussion and questions. So 1 Corinthians 7 verse 1 starts out, now regarding the questions you asked me in a letter. So clearly, the Corinthians, as we've talked about previously, had communicated to Paul with some problems that were present in their congregation, in their Christian community there in Corinth. And his very next sentence is, yes, it's good to abstain from sexual relations. Well, the commentaries say that this was reference to the Greek belief of asceticism, or the ascetics, who believed that many things were in order to live a holy life, you needed to do many things, one of which was abstain from sexuality. And in this context of the Corinthian church, it was incredibly important because Corinth was a city rampant with immorality. And so one response to immorality by some Greek Christians, ascetic, was this, you should abstain from sex. Then the passage from verse 3 to verse 7 has several things. And what I like about this section of our lesson today is the mutuality of it. Husbands, you should do this for your wives. Wives, you should do the exact same reciprocal thing for your husband. It's a balanced approach. Fulfill your sexual needs, give authority over your body. And then he says, don't deprive yourself of sexual relations unless you mutually agree on that for a brief period of perhaps spiritual reflection, devoting yourselves to prayer, but come back to it again, because it's an important part of marriage. And then verse 7, I wish everyone was single as I am, yet each person has a special gift from God. In the commentaries I read, quite a few suggest that Paul actually was probably married at one time in his life. And the two reasons for suggesting that are the following. Paul was a rabbi. He studied under Gamaliel. Remember in Acts, he said, I'm the Hebrew of all Hebrews. I've studied under Gamaliel. I was rigid in my beliefs. And one of the beliefs of the rabbis was that they had to be married. So if Paul was a rabbi before his Damascus Road experience, it's highly likely that he was married, according to that theory. The second reason is Paul was a member of the Sanhedrin, and members of the Sanhedrin were also expected to and required to be married. So if Paul was a rabbi and a member of the Sanhedrin before his conversion experience on the Damascus Road, he may have, and quite likely, was married. So how did he end up unmarried? Well, perhaps it's like we're going to discuss a little further down in this chapter. Suddenly Paul's a Christian, his wife isn't, and there's friction, and they separate on this basis. And by remaining single the rest of his life, Paul was honored what he describes here in this passage. It's also suggested that Paul, think about the life that Paul led from his Damascus Road experience through the rest of his life, traveling, constantly traveling, sleeping in different places, often on the road. It would be an incredibly difficult lifestyle for a wife and children. That's all I know about that topic, but Paul was definitely single during this time. Verse 8. For those of you who aren't married, and to widows, it's better to stay unmarried, just as I am. For those of you who are married, you shouldn't leave your husband, but if he does leave, let the single person remain single. Husband must not leave his wife, except for adultery. And verse 12, now I speak to the rest of you, though I do not have a direct command from the Lord. Everything else he said, the Lord has shown me, or we have in scripture this basis. Now he's saying, I'm going to give you some advice for me that I think is helpful. And he talks about spiritually mixed marriages. So if two non-Christians were married, and one of the spouses got converted to Christianity and the other spouse chose not to, Paul's advice was stay married. There's good things that can happen in that relationship, either spouse being the non-Christian. Perhaps by your life and example, you can convert them to be a Christian. And in verse 14, he suggests that there are benefits for the children growing up in a home where at least one spouse is a Christian. Verse 17, each of you should continue to live in whatever situation the Lord has placed you. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Then he has these two interesting comparisons in 18 through 24. Talks about circumcision. It's not important. It's important to keep God's commandment, but circumcision doesn't do anything for you. And it's got that odd suggestion in there. Verse 18, a man who was circumcised before he became a believer should not try to reverse it. I had no idea they had plastic surgery in biblical times, and I can't imagine a graft that would work in that situation. As a physician, that just puzzles me. Then in verse 20 and onward, he talks about slaves. If you're a slave when you became a Christian, continue to live in that state and be content. So the circumcision and the slave. And then finally, the end of the chapter, now regarding the question about the young women, some translations say virgins, about the young women who are not yet married. Here again, he says, I do not have a command from the Lord for them, but the Lord in his mercy has given me wisdom that can be trusted, and I will share it with you. Because of the present crisis, and I'm going to come to that in a minute, I think it's best you remain as you are, i.e. single. But if you have a wife, do not seek to end the marriage, and if you have, do not seek to get divorced or unmarried. Verse 29, the time remains short. Verse 32 again refers to the concerns of the present world. And then the final four verses, if a man thinks he's treating his fiancée improperly by staying single, in other words, you're engaged, but now he's saying stay single because of the present crisis. The commentaries I read on that said that those were probably people that didn't fall in love with each other. It was an arranged marriage. In the Hebrew tradition, parents picked out the respective parents decided to have their children married. And he was suggesting if you became a Christian in that scenario, it's best to remain single. But if you couldn't resist, it's better to get married than to sin. So, and then verse 39 and 40, the last two verses, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, and she's free to marry anyone else when her spouse dies, but only if the spouse loves the Lord. But in my opinion, it would be better for her to stay single. And I think I'm giving you counsel from God's Spirit when I say this. All right, that's an overview of the chapter. And I found some Old Testament references, one of the commentaries on the vital issues around marriage and divorce. So it's clear that marriage was originated by God in the garden. And there's the brief passage: "It's not good for man to live alone. I will make a helper who is just right for him. The two are united into one." So marriage is something that God himself gave to us initially in the garden with Adam and Eve. And then there's this challenging passage in Deuteronomy 24, which provided, and Dr. Neese in his audio, if you listen to it, talked about this quite extensively, provided for the possibility of issuing a document of divorce if she does not please me. Now that's pretty shabby, pretty thin rationale for getting married. I just don't like you anymore. But we do that in our culture today a lot. And then Malachi 2 rather, "The man who hates and divorces his wife does violence to the one he should protect." This is the NIV translation. You know, I like the New Living Translation, but a couple of commentaries suggested that some translations who translate this "God hates divorce" did not get the translation right. And then here's 3 verses from the New Testament, again on the vital issues of divorce. Matthew 5, when Jesus was referencing on the Sermon on the Mount, "I tell you that even if you look at another person with lust in your heart, you've already committed adultery." But this instance in Matthew 19 is when the scribes and the Pharisees came to Jesus and said, "Moses told us," referring to Deuteronomy 24, "that we could get divorced by issuing a certificate of divorce." And this was Jesus' response: "Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts, but it was not what God originally intended from the garden." Ephesians 5 is another passage about marriage. "Husbands and wives, submit to one another. Love your spouse as Christ loved the church." Marriage being symbolic of the relationship of Christ to the Christian church. And then finally, marriage is a great mystery, but it's an illustration of the way Christ and the church are one. And finally, 1 Peter 3, 1-7. "In the same way, you wives must accept the authority of your husbands. In the same way, you husbands must give honor to your wives." Not quite as, well, not the same language, but the same concept as our passage here. Mutual respect, mutual treatment in our relationship, in our sexual interactions, etc. Treat your wife with understanding. She may be weaker than you are, but she's your equal partner in God's gift of new life. So in our going back to our passage, there are several verses, and these are the 4, where Paul says, "Because of the present crisis, I think it's best to remain as you are. Those of you who get married at this time will have troubles, and I'm trying to spare you from those problems." Verse 29, "The time that remains is very short, and for this world as we know it will soon pass away." So it's very clear that Paul had the distinct impression that Jesus was going to come back to earth at any time, certainly within his lifetime. And it suggested that in the Christian church in Corinth, with the Roman non-Christian and Greek Roman non-Christian environment around them, that they were experiencing some degree of persecution and trials. And in light of that, Paul's suggesting in our passage, you might be better off spending more energy studying God's word and working on your relationship with Jesus and prayer than getting married and dividing your loyalties. So that's basically what Paul's saying. And then the other concept is Paul gives us in this passage: be content where you are. Each of you should continue to live in whatever situation the Lord has placed you and remain as you were when God first called you. These are all the same. Remain as you were, should remain as you were. I want you to be free from the concerns of this life. So that's my synopsis of the chapter. And I want to involve the class now. I have 2 questions. This is the first one. What are the patterns of thought and behavior that create cracks or fissures in a marriage? This is audience participation time.
Well,
Science.
So I think Paul alludes to one of them. It's the relationship between the two individuals in a marriage. And in the Western culture, certainly, we argue that it should be a relationship of equality. And in many instances, it's not viewed that way. And I think it leads to friction. At least I think that's one of the contributing factors, not treating each partner as equal.
Okay. Anyone else? Go ahead, Brett.
It's me.
The inability to forgive
Okay,
when there's an issue.
sure.
And communication.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I was just going to say I am a marriage counselor. So I was just going to say that marriage is a very complicated relationship because it is our most intimate relationship. And so all of the issues that each person has from childhood on is brought into the marriage, and often a lot of the fights that people have to do with unresolved personal issues that get projected and thrown around. And so it's a challenging relationship.
Absolutely. You deal with it every day as a therapist. Here's the reciprocal question. What are the patterns of thought and behavior that make for a happy and fulfilling marriage? Well, Kim said communication. Brett said mutual respect, I think something to that effect. Anything else?
But clearly there has to be a lot of trust between the two individuals. You have to trust each other and really feel that each one has the other one's back, so to speak.
What does that expression, "you got my back," mean to you, Si? People use that expression all the time.
Well, it means that, for me, the visual image is if I'm facing a conflict of some kind, I'm vulnerable in my back, and the other partner will not take advantage of that vulnerability, but would protect me in that instance. That's how I interpret it. I'm not sure that's the correct one, but that's how I interpret it, Loran.
Yeah. Carlene or Gary?
I think that selfishness in a marriage is a problem too, of one person being more selfish than the other,
Right.
not giving in.
That was referenced in multiple of the commentaries I read about this passage, selfishness. All right, let's move on. Oh, wait a second. Somebody, the McKeesey household has their hand up.
So I just thought it was also that we should be fulfilling each other's needs, whatever they might be.
Okay. Paul certainly references that here. Prentice.
One of the key parts of a happy, fulfilling marriage is not only the willingness to forgive and forget, but don't keep a scorecard of mistakes.
Okay. How about keeping Christ at the center? All right, now we're going to transition. And Daniel has two topics he's going to lead us in thinking about. One is spirituality and sexuality. The other one is a philosophy of marriage. So go ahead, Daniel.
Okay, you can hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right.
Yes. You could get a little closer to the microphone and that would help.
Okay, better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. In studying theology in undergraduate and graduate school, the main thing about an exegesis, looking at a text, is determining who wrote it, under what circumstances, and also the personality of the writer, that those are important things. I think we need to look at this letter to Corinth because Paul is believing, the umbrella is that Jesus is going to return in his lifetime. So we don't have any time to waste. Keep your eye on the prize and wait for the return of the Lord. So that's the umbrella. But I wanted to take a look at what was happening in the city of Corinth and what kind of city Corinth was. So if you could bring up that slide. Oh, it's already there, sorry. Aelian, the late Greek writer, tells us that if ever a Corinthian was shown upon a stage in a Greek play, he was shown drunk. The very name Corinth was synonymous with debauchery, and there was one source of evil in the city which was known all over the civilized world, and that was prostitution. Also in Corinth, there was a great temple of Aphrodite's. Poseidon had a temple. There was Apollo, Hermes, Venus, Fortuna, Isis, and one dedicated to all gods. And Paul references that in another time. Also, there were 1,000 cult prostitutes in Corinth. So it was a city where sailors came in, and it was a pleasurable place. Someone once said that Corinth was a porn site without the internet. So I want to talk about spirituality and sexuality. For many times, especially those of us that are older, those are private things. We didn't talk about sex. But I remember when I went to the seminary, Dr. Charles Witcherby, who was in charge of pastoral counseling, he wrote a book prior to going to the seminary in 1970, God Invented Sex. And he went around in the areas of Michigan and actually preached on sex for the sermon. And he, as you can imagine, he got a lot of criticism during that time. But if you look at Genesis, there's what's called in theology the Edenic covenant of Genesis. And so God created man in his image, and then God said, he blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth and subdue it. And that has to deal with sexuality. So on the screen, human sexuality is a part of your total personality. It involves the interrelationship of biological, psychological, sociocultural dimensions. It is a totality of our physical, emotional, and spiritual responses, thoughts, and feelings. These are by non-Christian researchers. Then the next slide. Spirituality is about discovering who we really are, our true and higher selves, created in the image of God, as against our self-centered everyday egos. Sexuality is obviously an important part of that. Neither repression, that would be asceticism, nor overindulgence, hedonism, leads to spiritual maturity. We must try and find another way for our own peace of mind, and as an example to others, loving relationships hold the key. Let's see. Spirituality is about discovering who we really are, our true higher selves created. Oh, I just read that. Sorry.
You just used that one, yes.
Yeah, sorry. I'm looking at my notes on my laptop here at the same time I'm trying to read the other ones. Okay, I wanted to say, as a professor once said in graduate school, sexuality is more than a gland finale. It is an opportunity to move past shame and defendedness because we're most naked and vulnerable during those times. There is a Greek myth in which the gods got together and they saw that a human being was both male and female and would become more godlike. And they had a powwow and decided to split the human into twos, male and female. So I wanted to talk about, in context of that, something that Scott Peck said. So if you could get the next, there we go. So according to the myth, this splitting of humans, sexuality arises out of a sense of incompleteness and is manifested by an urge towards wholeness and a yearning for the Godhead. Then Peck says, but what is our spirituality if not the same thing? Sexuality and spirituality are not, of course, exactly the same thing. They're not identical twins, but they are kissing cousins. And they arise out of the same kind of ground, not only in myth, but in an actual human experience. The fact that sex is the closest thing that many people ever come to spiritual experience. Indeed, it is because it is a spiritual experience of sorts that so many chase after with repetitive, desperate kind of abandon. The subjective quality of the orgasmic experience is, of course, highly dependent on the quality of the relationship of the partners involved. And then the quote from Richard Rohr, the people who know God well, mystics, hermits, prayerful people, those who risk everything to find God, always meet a lover, not a dictator. Okay, the next slide. The 4 levels involved in sexuality. One is we have a body with hormones, instincts overlaid with morality, value, and love. So as you can see, it's pretty complex, our sexuality. Second, the being of significance to another who would do anything to enhance our emotional well-being. 3, spiritual bonding with another leading to the becoming of one flesh. And then the 4th, we don't have an agrarian society in America mostly. It's pretty technologically based. But in former days, a man got a wife so they could have children to help in the farm and lessen his load. The next idea is that our God is a God on the make, as Scott Peck says. There is a poem called The Hound of Heaven that first was introduced in theology back at Loma Linda. The Hound of Heaven was the title of it. It's a 182-line poem written by an English poet, Francis Thompson, in 1893. And there's a more modern version of it that you can actually see with music and all of that. But I thought this would be actually better. And Scott Peck says our God is a lover God, a God on the make. So here's the first part of the modernized. I heard a story once, an incredible story, an amazing story. It told of one who was relentlessly faithful and loves with an unwavering love. It was said that he sorrows over broken people. It was said that he tirelessly pursued the lost one, never stopping, never giving up until. But what if I let him in? What would I have to give up? What would I have left to say that it was mine? Anyway, it was just a story I heard, just a story. Then here's the rest of the story at the end of the poem. I finally reached out to the one who had sought me for so long. The lost one was finally found. He required nothing, nothing beyond acceptance. The peace I had longed for and never known had flooded my heart. And in having nothing of my own, nothing but his love, I found everything I had lacked. I was finally complete, finally at rest in him. Are there any comments or questions about anything I've said so far about the correlationship between sexuality and spirituality?
What did you say? They weren't identical twins. They were kissing cousins.
Yes. They're very close. Actually, Scott Peck in one of his lectures said, you cannot stimulate one without the other. And so he said, people in spiritual professions should guard themselves very carefully.
We have a hand raised, Deanna.
Yes, I was wondering too if you could address, isn't it biologically something that that in the brain, actually in the brain, are the areas of sexuality and spirituality somewhat close together or interrelated?
Yes,
That's a really
actually
good question.
true.
And as a physician, I should probably know the answer, but I'm not sure that I do. Ted, do you got any thought about that? Ted's shaking his head no too.
That is true. The research suggests that it's that same part of the brain.
Okay. Kind of thought it was, but I didn't know for sure.
Okay, shall we go to the philosophy of marriage? Okay, but before we get to that slide, I want to share something that when I was taking theology, the class of theologians, all of us went on to pastor churches and so forth and so on. But what was interesting, the men, because there were no females in the class at that time, all of the men married, and they opened up about that and said it was to legitimize sex because you weren't supposed to have sex until you were married. So it was a way to legitimize your urge for sexuality. And to get a call to the conference, you had to be married. So a lot of young guys went and got married so that they could legitimize sex, and also they could get a call to the conference. Also, the conferences didn't want single good-looking pastors there in the churches. Well, there was a survey that was done, and it found out that my class at Loma Linda, that at the age of 40, over 60% of my classmates had left their spouses and 40% had left their ministry. So which is worse, divorcing for the wrong reason or marrying for the wrong reason? That's a rhetorical question. Let's take a look at what is marriage for. And so what I want to talk about first is what it's not for. Marriage does not remove loneliness. Marriage won't make you happy. Marriage is not about finding fulfillment. It's not an escape from low self-worth. Because someone loves me and values me, it doesn't make your low self-esteem go away if you have it. And it's not providing unending sexual ecstasy. I like the working definition of marriage are two friends in love. What makes a friendship? You have attraction, you have respect, and even more than that, they love what you love. That's why we have golf buddies and tennis buddies and music buddies and all of that, because they may not be exactly who we are or like who we are, but they love what we love. There's been a saying in Christianity that a family that prays together stays together. I would like to suggest it isn't about prayer, but it's two partners that both love God and God's principles. And the glue that holds them together is they both love the same thing. Okay, so now to the slide. It takes a long time to move from possessiveness, self-serving, and individuality to serving and loving without requirements. Then the next slide. Marriage is not a beautiful rose, but more like an aloe vera plant, which provides healing properties, but there are also thorns to deal with. The next slide.
I like this one.
True marriage and true love is never about you. It's about the person you love, their wants, their needs, their hopes, their dreams. Selfishness demands, what's in it for me? While love asks, what can I give? I love that from Scott Peck. I'd like to talk about the allegory of the long spoons, which was reported by Rabbi Haim of Lithuania. The story goes that a man dies and he's taken by an angel up to heaven. And he witnesses a scene there. And he says, you know, I've always liked looking at both sides of the issue. So could you take me down to hell? Because I'd like to see what the other side's like. Well, according to the story, it was exactly the same thing. There were people around and there was food on the table, but one group of people were starving to death and the other people were enjoying their food. So if you could bring up that slide. There's hell. Notice the spoons are too long and they're all desperately trying to feed themselves. Next slide. Heaven. Notice they're all fed because they're all feeding each other. I believe that's a beautiful concept of Christianity and marriage.
Daniel, we have a hand up. Ted Hamilton has a comment
Sure.
or a question.
So Daniel, can you back up about 5 slides?
Well, that's up to me to do.
Okay. Back it up to that statement that says something about how long it takes to that there, right there. It takes a long time to move from possessiveness, self-serving, and individuality to serving and loving without requirements. I think that is even harder for young people who grew up Adventist. So Jackie and I both grew up Adventist, and she tells this story, so I think it's okay for me to tell it too. We grew up in very, very different Adventist homes. The home I grew up in was an Ellen White home. In virtually every way that you might characterize it, it was an Ellen White home. And what we eat, what we didn't eat, what we did on Saturday night or did not do on Saturday night, or even all day Sabbath, what we did on Sabbath and did not do on Sabbath. Jackie's family was pretty much the polar opposite of that. And we did not know that when we got married. We had dated for 1.5 years or so at Southern Adventist, now Southern Adventist University, Southern Missionary College then. But where this says it takes a long time to get over possessiveness, self-serving, and individuality, I'm probably still not over being raised an Ellen White Adventist. And it really does take a long time. Is this experience unique to us, or have others experienced anything remotely like that? Here's one experience. Jackie went to the grocery store after we set up our first apartment at Loma Linda, and she came back with Jell-O. And I said, does that Jell-O have, I don't know, maybe it wasn't Jell-O. Marshall, does it have pork lard in it? And Jackie said, are you kidding me? What? I said, it has to have vegetable shortening. And that was like she had never heard that before. And that's just one small example. I mean, there were a multitude of these things. How do you get past that? How do you change not just what you believe? How do you change your reality to become a mutually not just acceptable, but mutually enhancing reality? That was very, very hard for us.
So Ted,
Yes.
Sai here.
I'm-
It's compounded by the fact that each of us coming from a different setting says, my upbringing is better than yours. And you have to fight that issue as well. I am right and you're wrong. And it's not easy.
We moved over 2,000 miles from where I grew up. We were nowhere near my parents, but that parent was in my mind virtually every day.
It was the voice in your head, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was my reality. It wasn't so much what I believed as it was who I was. So when you're talking about moving from, it's moving from one's identity, moving from one's self, if you will, and perhaps that is the selfishness that Daniel referred to. Well, there it is in the statement: self-serving and individuality.
I'd like to say something, Ted, what you brought up,
Growth.
and also Sai. In psychology, there's a term called symbiosis, and what that means is I think everybody wants what I want and values what I value and loves what I love and hates what I hate. And getting over that is a prime thing as an individual as well as a marriage.
Linda or Breck?
Well, I was just going to say that we also come into marriage with very different models of marriage that we observed with our parents. And so we're coming in with issues from woundedness, because we all get wounded in childhood, some greatly and some minimally, but we all get wounded. And we're often then polarized on issues too. Maybe one person is very extroverted and they end up with an introverted partner. And so it just requires a lot of ability to come together and compromise and negotiate. And I think as I work with people, what I see is that when you get married, there's this wonderful God-given opportunity to heal one another, but there's also what often happens is that instead of healing one another, we just continue wounding one another in a lot of the same ways we were wounded when we came into the marriage. So it's challenging.
It's amazing it works.
I wanted to say something. Loran and I got married 3 months after Loran started medical school, and we moved out to California. And Loran and I had been separated for months and months. And we wrote letters and we talked on the phone, and we talked about our hopes and our dreams, and we talked about what our life was going to look like, what it was going to be. And we made some decisions. We talked about where we wanted to live when Loran was done. We talked about simple things like how we were going to eat. And I remember one of the things that Loran and I decided is that we were going to eat vegetarian. Now that's just a real simple thing. Well, it was not a simple thing. I grew up eating meat, and Loran grew up eating vegetarian, maybe eating meat occasionally. And so the problem and the dilemma was I did not know how to cook vegetarian. And so Loran became the recipient of some very good meals and some very bad meals. And I think what it did, it taught both of us that marriage can't be so black and white. marriage has to be a trip to Marie Callender so Loretta can have a hamburger because she's craving it so badly, and that Loran can eat food that isn't so great every now and then. But my point is, you have hopes and dreams, and sometimes they can be very, very black and white, because all the things that we said we wanted to do, Loran was going to either do OB or family medicine. We were going to live in Virginia. None of that happened. And I'm kind of person that, what happened? Wait a minute here. These are the things we said we wanted. And then all of a sudden life didn't work out that way. And so I think in a marriage, you have to develop a rhythm. But I also think, and Loran says to me all the time, you have to give each other grace. And I appreciate that about Loran, because we have strong personalities and we have strong opinions, and we can be very black and white with each other. And we just kind of have this code where we'll say, well, I think we need some grace right now. So I understand how Ted feels, because Loran came out of a similar home and I did not. And yet, probably to this day, there's residual there. But I think when you marry in your 20s, you really don't know who you are. You really haven't matured. Your brain hasn't matured. And yet that love, that grace, and that rhythm somehow, by the grace of God, works out, and you continue to take the journey together.
Amen to that. Anyone else?
Lauren, I think obviously you've learned one key to a successful marriage, and you just said it. Amen to that.
Another saying I learned is, I like what she likes.
And Marie Callender's, Lauren, don't forget that.
Yes, Marie Callender's, yeah.
Nobody has said this, but Gary and I think that children bring a stress to the marriage. They bring tremendous joy, but they bring stress to the marriage. And Gary says the husband goes on the back burner for 20 years, especially for working women. So, I think that's a stressor to the marriage, even though they bring tremendous joy.
One psychologist said that each child to a marriage is like a hand grenade in a soldier's foxhole.
Brett, you have your hand up.
Yeah, well, when kids come in, our roles change. It's no longer us, it's them. So now you have to compromise and learn each other all over again, because now you have you have this baby, you have this child in your home now, in your life.
Mm-hmm.
So what we are in marriage in our 20s changes when the kids leave home, and then we have to discover what marriage means in our 40s and 50s when the kids leave home. So that grace we were talking about earlier comes into play. And yeah, we do have to learn each other all over again once kids are not in the mix.
Annette, you have a comment.
I was blessed to be married to someone that I miss, and he loved me even when I changed. My mother was suggesting a gentleman for me to date recently, and she said, now you need to take your jewelry off because he's conservative and he won't want you with your jewelry. And it just made me appreciate what I had, with Bob. Most of you know him. So, because, for a long time I didn't wear jewelry. Then I decided I was, okay with wearing jewelry. And he loved me and appreciated me with that change. One time he said later on, I don't really like jewelry, but because you like it, I buy it for you.
Nice.
And I think that's kind of what Loretta's saying, we can give each other grace as we change and become different people and still appreciate each other.
Nicely put. Albert.
This may seem like an oversimplification. No really psychology, no M. Scott Peck here. But back in Christ's day, there was some confusion back there. And I just try at least to live by Christ's words. He said, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. If you want happiness in this life, whether you're single or whether you're married, then copy me, follow me, do the things I did, and you'll be a happy person, whether you're alone or whether you're married. God bless.
How many years has that worked for you and your wife?
Well, we're coming up on 65.
Wow.
Yeah, happy years.
There you go. All right. Anyone else? Daniel, I think I'm going to call an audible here. We got about 5 minutes left. Let's, I'm sorry, buddy, but let's go to this. Here's 4 questions, and you can respond to any one of these that captures your thought. Anyone? Sorry, you trying to unmute yourself and speak?
Okay, so what I love about being married is companionship. It's lonely if you're by yourself, and having that companionship and having someone who could point out your shortcomings to you so that you could be, as it were, sandpapered into a more agreeable person is what I love about marriage.
That doesn't fit under the category of things you find most difficult?
Well, it sometimes can be,
Yeah.
but then it's good medicine.
It's good medicine, yeah. Anyone else? Bob.
Yeah, as someone who's recently transitioned from one category to the other, I find it interesting to read. It's Christian authors when they're talking about marriage. They seem to express a kind of shock that, oh my goodness, Christians get divorced at the same rate as everyone else. And the implication is, well, that's not supposed to happen. Christians are supposed to be better. So then what emerges, it seems to me, is something of a stigma. It's like, well, maybe you're just not as good a Christian as you think you are. So there's this big sort of conflation of bad Christian, because Christians shouldn't get divorced. Bad Christian, therefore you get divorced. I mean, maybe I'm being hypersensitive here, but what about this assumption that Christians should be better than everyone else? And yet it seems like we have the same problems that everyone else does.
Why do you think that is, Bob?
I think we're all struggling with this condition that's called humanness. And we sort of forget that. And it's like, no, as an Adventist, I'm very familiar with the idea of, well, no, I'm not supposed to be just a Christian. I'm supposed to be a super Christian. And it's like, really? That is not my experience either.
Anyone else?
I want to comment something Bob just said, because I think it's important. I think we Christians have this difficulty that there's 2 layers. There's the ideal, that's becoming more like our Lord. And the other is the real, about who we are. And as Linda was talking about, our wounding from the past, our own proclivities, addictions, whatever they may be. And so we're always in this dynamic tension between the ideal that I want to be and the real, who I am at this present moment in time.
Okay, any other thoughts? Winding down to the last couple of minutes. Linda?
Well, nobody's mentioned how, since God gifted us with marriage, and but nobody's mentioned how Satan attacks it. And if it's one of God's best gifts, we can be sure that Satan is really working in there to destroy marriages and families. And that's a reality too.
Absolutely. That's a really, really good point. So I went to my favorite source of material. I have several websites, bible.org and biblegateway.org, but just good old Google. I found some things like 32 famous quotes about marriage. I'm not going to give you 32, but I think I've got a couple here. I see heads nodding. Apparently this is resonating with some of you. I love the first one. Second one too. Whenever you're right, shut up. Don't gloat. Don't gloat.
Email it to us, Lauren.
What's that, Cheryl?
Email it to us.
These pages here?
Yeah, beautiful.
All right. And one more page. Nice one from President Reagan there. And one from a romance novel author. So in closing, and I know Cy teaches this topic, so I'm not going to steal your thunder, Cy, but Daniel and I were talking about what does Paul ultimately say about marriage, and how many wedding ceremonies have you been to where 1 Corinthians 13 was read? And these are some of the qualities of two people in love and of a solid, strong marriage. Keeps no record of wrongs, like that one. All right. Thank you for joining us today. You all have a good Sabbath and an excellent new week. And we will see you next Sabbath. Bye, everyone.
Bye.